let me show you a book. This is Eliezer Albin's Unnatural History of Spiders and Other Curious Insects, illustrated with 53 copper plates engraved by the best hands. I became acquainted with this book after I became Special Collections Librarian, having been a reference librarian at St. Lawrence University for 20 years. Thinking about my new responsibilities and the changes they wrought in my life got me thinking about all the change lurking in a library. You might think of a book as a particular point of view, written at a particular time and place, pages permanent. I realize now that when I pull a book down off the shelf, I'm pulling change off the shelf. I realize that A Natural History of Spiders mashes up art and science in such a unique way that it asks me, what is a book? So reading the book, not reading Eliezer's description of spiders great and small, lively as it is, but reading what I'm holding. This is a folio book. That means that the pieces of paper, called leaves, are folded in half, then divided up, then sewn into the binding. These are called gatherings. Counting gatherings is a very precise way to measure a book. Gatherings usually begin with a letter at the bottom of a page, like this B at the bottom of page 1. Whoops, I seem to have lost the PowerPoint. There we go. Now you see, if it was a book, it would have been working the entire time. And there we find, yes. There we see at the bottom of the page this B, which is the start of the second gathering. There are also catchwords throughout the book. Catchwords come down from medieval manuscripts, and they're prompts for printers to get the pages in the proper order. If I was going to write a description of this book for descriptive bibliographies, I'd count the gatherings, I'd count the catchwords, I'd count the illustrations, which are called plates. I do this because I want the world to know how this book welcomes us. Therein is the change for me. Not that I've come to learn to appreciate books, but I've learned a specific way to parse that appreciation. I've learned how books introduce themselves to us, and I've learned to express what books are in a way I didn't know existed. Now, the marvelous illustrations in this book, like this splendid flea, complete with catchwords, make this book its own place, its own museum. This has been apparent for a long time. Search on the St. Lawrence University Library's website on Eliezer Albin, and you'll find that in 1926, Scientific Monthly proclaimed, Albin's portrait indicates that he was a rather built man, probably somewhat swanky in the view of the quality of his subscribers. Nevertheless, he puts something of himself in each of his books, and there is a certain friendliness about them that is non-existent in the cold, impersonal, and standardized manuals of today. And here we can see Eliezer in his green coat and black hat on the title page. We can very concretely document something about the art and friendliness of this book by trying to look at the book. And this is important skill building, because old books focus the inquisitiveness college students have and the curiosity they need to create a worldview. College students should be open to new perspectives, but that takes an eye for detail. It takes practice to find the new in what seems settled. Old books provide that practice. Descriptive bibliography is all about noting everything you possibly can about a book, often for purposes of selling or collecting the book. Delving into the specifics of a book gives college students an opportunity to see that seeking the new in the old sharpens the ability to turn an intuition into an explanation. In moderation, descriptive bibliography can be a change agent because it's outside of the scope of student experience. For college students, it's something new. It's terrain they have not traversed. Now, it's terrain that can get a little weird, but weird is good for exploration. Old books beg someone to explicate their charm. Explicating the charm in things happens in a lot of academic work. In contrast to being online and distracted, studying detail is intrinsic to descriptive bibliography. Focusing on the specifics of the books gives students an opportunity in real time to reflect on the relationship between curiosity and detail. Because it is offline, it is an exercise in figuring out the figure-outable. By explicating a book down to the feel of the paper, students can demonstrate to themselves that, with attention, problems are solvable. Now, when I say that archival research is outside of the scope of student experience, I can turn to research published by the Pew Research Center. My 4 children are not anomalies. Young people spend a lot of time online. But this doesn't mean they don't read, and it doesn't mean they don't have an opinion about books. So I'm sensing an opportunity here. Young people may be nascent book people, and an exercise in changing their opinion about old books in the name of figuring out the figure-outable is well worth a walkthrough. So, this is a 256-year-old edition of Tristram Shandy. Tristram Shandy is one of the weirdest books ever published in England, and it's an important book in the emergence of the novel in the 18th century in England. This is a beautiful edition of that old book. Is it a first edition? Walk students through a search in the JSTOR database on first editions of Tristram Shandy. When you do that, you'll find an article published in 1932 by Lewis Curtis on first editions. Curtis reports that the author of Tristram Shandy, Lawrence Sterne, approached Robert Dodsley with an offer of £50 to print the first edition. This is, in fact, a Dodsley edition. However, Curtis argues that the first edition was printed by a widow named Anne Ward in York, England in 1759. Now, let's explore this with a little descriptive bibliography. The feel of an old book comes from the paper. You can actually feel the texture of the mold that made the paper. We call this kind of paper made from linen laid paper. Now, on the fly leaf, you can see a design impressed into the texture of the paper. This is called a watermark. Watermarks identify paper makers. According to Curtis, the watermark here and all the apparent details on the watermark are consistent with a 1760 edition. Now, in this volume's gatherings happen about every 8 leaves. This is an octago volume with 8 leaf gatherings. In bibliographers' notation, it looks something like this. Well, that means something to me. Curtis reports that Anne Ward only lettered the first 3 gatherings in the book she printed. So this means this is not a 1759 edition, not a first edition. Now finally, Curtis writes that there was an advertisement for Tristram Shandy in the York Courant, a newspaper published in 1759. The advertisement included an illustration of the title page. The title page as a Greek epigram. Curtis writes that the typeset of that epigram is different than the typeset we see here. Proof of A, an edition before 1760, and B, a different press. So we don't have a first edition, but we have a first Robert Dodsley edition, and we're able to explore with students that this very important book was originally printed by a woman running her own printing business in the 18th century. We can do this with a little descriptive bibliography and a little publication history. A good recipe. Now, Sterne signed these books. Stern signed Robert Dodsley editions as a way to authenticate them, to use a term from our time, to license them. This says something very interesting about the book trade then and now, but it also means that he handled these editions. He held these books. Writing about archival research in the spring of 1996 in the Hudson Review, Dana Gioia wrote, "The experience of studying great manuscripts reminds the viewer that each individual work is a conversation, an imaginative and emotional transaction, one person to another, a bridge across time and place. Reading is never more intimate than with script. The hand of the poet reaches out to greet the reader." Now, Gioia is writing about reading handwritten documents, but I think what he's writing is applicable to these books. Stern's hand reaches out to greet us, and not just from the signatures, but from the entirety of the object. Further underlying the uniqueness of these books is that they come from Josephine Young's library. Josephine Young was Owen D. Young's wife. Owen D. Young is the namesake of the main library at St. Lawrence University, plays a very prominent role in the history of the university and the General Electric Corporation, where he was CEO. We bought these books from their daughter, Josephine Young Case, in 2005. That we can move students from Lawrence Stern, that we can actually tease a story from Lawrence Stern to Anne Ward to Josephine Young means that we can move students from Lawrence Stern to Anne Ward to Josephine Young. Time travel is a natural occurrence. It happens all the time, but you have to know to look for it. Our students, as a rule, have not had an opportunity to look for it. Books are time travel. Now, sometimes I will hand a student a book like one of these, and they'll actually recoil from the book, afraid the book will come to harm. No, it's a good thing. They're afraid that something's going to happen to the book. But in fact, it's handling the books that gets the students to really considering the books, to really consider the books. It's handling the books that gives the students the experience of the resiliency and the fragility of old books. It gives them an experience similar to that described by David L. Vandermuller at the end of his memoir about bibliographical study and deciphering books, when he wrote, "As someone in the 18th century said, hope springs eternal. Maybe the next edition will clear up all the mysteries. Bibliography is fun. Particularly if we consider fun reposition curiosity. Put it on the shelf over here. We've got a bunch of old books. And suddenly the idea that books have a personality and an ancestry reverberates." Now, let's have some fun with a mystery in a very famous book. This is a first edition of Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. The library has both volumes. This is a signed edition. Smith signed this, and in pencil somebody wrote, "Presentation copy from the author." So this means that Smith designated these two volumes to help him sell books. Now, there's something kind of interesting. After page 579, we find additions and corrections to the first and second editions of Dr. Adam Smith's Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations. Smith wrote this pamphlet and published it in 1784. Someone's sewn it into the volume too, and you can see it doesn't actually, if you look up at the top there, it doesn't actually quite fit into the book. Who would do such a thing? Well, on the cover of both volumes, there is a family crest that reads, "Fear God and fear not." This is the family crest of one Edward Hawke Locker. Who is Edward Hawke Locker? Well, according to the Dictionary of National Biography, Locker was born in 1777 and lived until 1849. He was a hospital administrator and a painter and an art collector of some note. He's a founding member of the Athenaeum in London. We know from a book catalog that several editions of Wealth of Nations were in the Athenaeum library, so Locker knew of the book. Now, images I've seen of pristine editions of the 1776 Wealth of Nations have a different cover. Locker's son, Frederick Locker Lamson, wrote in his autobiography, "Mr. Bedford, the famous bookbinder, was an old and valued acquaintance of mine and a rare friend to the book-collecting race." Did Mr. Bedford sew on the new cover and sew the 1784 editions into Volume 2? Pure conjecture. However, it's a pretty good mystery for some St. Lawrence University student. Programs like our Adirondack semester and our community-based learning program ask students to consider our locale. And what I'm suggesting is that considering the locale in an old book is a great model for considering the other locales in one's life, including that locale which is finding meaning in undertaking college study. Thank you.